England built most of its rural farmhouses between 1485 and 1603, the Tudor era, and a significant number are still standing, still occupied, still farming the same land. These aren't museums, they're working properties where people wake up inside timber frames that were already old when Shakespeare was alive, pay council tax, argue about damp, and fight listed building restrictions to install a new boiler. You know what nobody tells you about why they survived? The romantic version says careful preservation, cultural heritage, families lovingly maintaining ancestral homes across generations. That version is mostly false. These buildings survived because nobody could afford to tear them down. Lavenham became the most intact Tudor townscape in England precisely because its economy collapsed in the 1500s and it became too poor to modernise. Pembridge's timber farmhouses exist because Henry VIII destroyed the monasteries and flooded the market with church land. They were built by the beneficiaries of state-sponsored vandalism. Eardisland's farmhouses remain because the village has fewer people now than in 1600 and depopulation eliminated development pressure. Preservation through poverty, survival through irrelevance. Buildings that lasted not because they were loved, but because each generation found them useful enough to maintain and too expensive to replace. The question that gets uncomfortable the longer you sit with it: when does a house stop being old and start being proof that some things were simply built to last forever? 1. Lavenham, Suffolk. Population roughly 1,700, located 30 miles southeast of Cambridge. Over 340 listed buildings, most dating from the 15th and 16th centuries, making it the most intact medieval and Tudor wall town in England. Here is what makes Lavenham extraordinary. It exists in this condition because it failed completely. The crooked, timber-framed houses lining the streets weren't built crooked. They're the result of green oak drying and warping over 500 years inside walls that nobody ever knocked down. Tudor builders used freshly cut oak because seasoned timber took years to dry and cost significantly more. They knew it would twist. They built anyway. Structural integrity doesn't require straight lines. Those frames that look unstable have been standing since the 1480s, moving, breathing, flexing without breaking. At its peak in the early 1500s, Lavenham was the 14th wealthiest town in England, richer than Lincoln, richer than York, entirely because of wool and cloth. Merchants made fortunes. They built elaborate timber-framed houses to show it, competing in displays of wealth through intricate framing patterns, jettied upper floors, carved decoration. Then the wool trade collapsed. The merchants left. The town lost its entire reason to exist, and that failure saved it. No Georgian refronting, no Victorian industrial expansion, no 1960s redevelopment schemes, not because anyone valued preservation, but because nobody had the money to destroy it. The grand houses built by cloth merchants in 1520 simply stayed, generation after generation, too expensive to demolish, too structurally sound to fall down, too useful to abandon. These aren't museums, people live in them, which means centuries of modifications. Chimneys added when central hearths became unfashionable, windows enlarged for more light, electricity routed through medieval floor plans, modern plumbing installed through timber frames never designed for it. Every generation adapted the buildings to remain functional. The buildings survived, not despite this, but because of it. Useful buildings get maintained. Economic collapse became accidental time capsule. The wool trade that built Lavenham is gone. The buildings it paid for remain. 2. Pembridge, Herefordshire, population around 1,000, a black and white village on the Welsh border where Tudor, timber-framed farmhouses line every street, multiple still in private residential and farming use. The building boom here wasn't organic economic growth, it was the largest forced property transfer in English history. When Henry VIII dissolved the monasteries between 1536 and 1541, enormous tracts of agricultural land that had been controlled by religious houses for centuries suddenly hit the market. Church land that yeoman farmers could never have afforded became available. They bought it. Then they built on it. Elaborate timber-framed farmhouses announcing new status, new ownership, new power. These houses weren't funded by generations of careful saving. They were funded by buying up the ruins of an economic system Henry dismantled for political reasons. The timber came cheap for the same reason. Dissolution flooded the market. Forests previously held by monasteries were sold. Wood that would have been reserved for church building became available for domestic construction. The families who built Pembridge's farmhouses used that cheap timber. The fortunes are long gone. The timber frames are still there. Pembridge also has a detached medieval market hall still standing in the square, built around 1500. It lost its market function generations ago. Nobody tore it down because nobody needed to. Easier to ignore than demolish. It persisted through indifference, not affection. The black and white aesthetic Herefordshire is known for wasn't a designed look. Black coating protects timber. Lime wash protects wattle and daub infill. Every generation repainted the same way because it worked. Practical maintenance accidentally created regional identity. The monks who controlled this land for 400 years were dispersed in a decade. The farmhouses built by the people who replaced them are still standing, still farming, free. Eardisland, Herefordshire, population under 600. A village on the River Arrow with thatched, timber-framed farmhouses dating to the 1500s, several still in active agricultural use. The uncomfortable fact, this village has fewer people now than it did in 1600. These buildings didn't survive because the community thrived and carefully preserved its heritage. They survived because the population declined, development pressure never materialized, and nobody ever had economic reason to replace structures that still functioned as farms. Eardisland never got a railway connection. It remained genuinely remote until modern roads arrived. It never industrialized, never expanded, never became picturesque enough for early tourism gentrification. It persisted in agricultural use because agriculture was all it ever had. The Tudor farmhouses remained farmhouses not through heritage designation, but through continuous function. Nobody converted them into something else because there was no market pressure, no outside money, no reason to change. Economic stagnation became architectural preservation. The thatched cottages sit directly on the riverbank, essentially unchanged for 400 years. They're not unchanged because each generation chose preservation. They're unchanged because replacement never became necessary or affordable. These are working agricultural properties where heritage is secondary to function. Modern farm equipment stores in Tudor barns. Satellite dishes mount on 16th century rooflines. Several properties show continuous family ownership for over 200 years. That sounds romantic until you recognize it also means limited economic mobility, multi-generational attachment to marginal agricultural land, families staying partly because leaving was harder than remaining. Depopulation preserved what prosperity would have destroyed. There's nothing romantic about that mechanism, but the buildings are still standing. 4. Wearbley, Herefordshire, population around 1,100. One of the highest concentrations of black and white Tudor buildings anywhere in England, including working farmhouses on the village edges in continuous occupation since the 1500s. Before the Reform Act of 1832, this village of fewer than 200 voters sent 2 members of parliament to Westminster, while industrial cities like Manchester had none. Textbook rotten borough. Parliamentary seats sold to the highest bidder, elections a formality, representation completely disconnected from population or economic importance. The political absurdity lasted over 200 years. The timber-framed houses watched the entire performance. The Reform Act abolished Wearbley's borough status in 1832, formalizing what had already happened. The place didn't matter anymore. But that sliver of political relevance, however corrupt, kept Wearbley on maps, kept it barely visible, prevented it from disappearing entirely into agricultural obscurity. It declined early enough, late 1500s, early 1600s, that nobody rebuilt in Georgian or Victorian styles. It stayed poor enough that modernization never arrived. It remained just relevant enough to avoid complete abandonment. Perfect alignment of prosperity at exactly the right time, followed by stagnation at exactly the right pace. The farmhouses still function as working properties, which means owners navigating listed building restrictions while trying to run viable agricultural operations, heating costs in buildings designed for central hearths, inadequate wiring, damp that requires constant management. Listing protects the buildings but makes living in them expensive and legally complicated. The rotten borough got reformed. The timber frames weren't. 5. Chiddingstone, Kent. Population under 200. An entire village street of Tudor and Jacobean houses preserved so completely, it's been used as a film set for period dramas for decades. This wasn't preservation, it was ownership. The Streatfeild family purchased almost the entire village in the 17th century and held it for roughly 300 years without significant development. Not because they were heritage-minded, because they didn't need to maximize profit from each property. No individual owners making independent renovation decisions. No competitive market pressure to modernize. No piecemeal development driven by changing economics. Single ownership froze the village through centuries when everywhere else was rebuilding. That's deeply uncomfortable for heritage narratives emphasizing democratic access and community preservation. Chiddingstone survived as architectural time capsule specifically because of feudal-style land consolidation. One family controlling an entire settlement, making decisions across generations without market interference. The result looks too perfect to be real. Film crews use it precisely because it appears artificially preserved, but it wasn't preserved. It was simply held, largely unchanged, because changing it required no economic advantage to the family that owned it. Working farmsteads still operate at the village edges from Tudor-era buildings. Some residents have been there for generations, but tourism revenue now outweighs agricultural income. The building survived 400 years of farming. Whether they survive being too picturesque is the current question. The Streatfields eventually sold. The village they held for 3 centuries remains almost exactly as they left it, not because it was loved by many, but because it was controlled by few. 6. Bignor, West Sussex, population around 400. A Wealden village in the South Downs where the Yeoman's House, a classic 3-bay Wealden Hall house, still stands in working agricultural use alongside other late medieval farmsteads. These weren't built by aristocrats, they were built by yeoman farmers, prosperous but not wealthy, the Tudor equivalent of successful middle class. People who worked their own land, employed a few labourers, made comfortable livings without extravagance. They built houses that have lasted 500 years. The Wealden Hall House is a specific architectural type unique to Kent and Sussex. Central open hall with flanking 2-story bays, wide overhanging upper floor, recessed hall creating distinctive roofline. Not designed by architects, but evolved through generations of practical building, shaped by local timber abundance, lack of stone, need for efficient heating, social expectations about how space should be divided and used. Vernacular architecture in the true sense, buildings emerging from regional materials and regional needs, not imposed design. These farmers built well not because they were trying to create dynasties or leave legacies. They built well because that's simply how you built. The gap between ordinary construction and exceptional construction was narrower than modern building culture assumes. Durability wasn't luxury, it was standard. Bignor is also known for its Roman villa, with extraordinary mosaics, carefully preserved, visited, interpreted. The juxtaposition matters. The Roman villa is heritage, managed as museum. The Tudor farmhouses are just old, still working farms, still lived in, not visited. Both are ancient. One required institutional rescue, the other survived by remaining useful to people with ordinary resources, generation after generation, without special intervention. The yeoman farmers who built these houses are 5 centuries gone. The buildings they constructed as simple working farmhouses remain, proof that ordinary people building well-created something closer to permanence than anyone intended. 7. Leominster, Herefordshire, population around 11,000, the market town at the heart of the Herefordshire Black and White Village Trail, with Tudor farmhouses in the surrounding parishes that have been in the same family for multiple generations. Henry VIII dissolved Leominster Priory in 1539. The institution that had controlled the local economy for centuries vanished in administrative strokes. Its timber holdings hit the market, its lands were sold, its stored materials became available to anyone who could pay. The families who bought those resources built farmhouses with them in the 1540s through 1560s. The building boom is directly traceable to dissolution, not despite it, because of it. These farmhouses are monuments to England's greatest act of state-sponsored vandalism, built by the beneficiaries using the materials on the land released when Henry dismantled the monastic system for political convenience and financial gain. The priory church survives partially, now serving as parish church, fragments of what existed. The economic institution is gone. The farmhouses funded by its destruction remain, still working farms, still privately occupied, still standing 480 years later. Several show continuous family occupation from the 1500s or 1600s forward. Generational holding across centuries, not aristocratic dynasty, but farming families who simply stayed, passing land, parent to child through the Reformation, Civil War, industrialization, mechanization, 2 world wars, agricultural collapse, and revival. That continuity sounds romantic until you recognize it also reflects limited mobility, multi-generational attachment to holdings that were never wealthy enough to leave but never failing enough to abandon. The priory that funded half this town's construction was destroyed. The buildings it paid for survived. 8. Wilmcote, Warwickshire. Population around 500. Home to Mary Arden's farm, the Tudor farmhouse where Shakespeare's mother grew up, which remained a working farm for centuries precisely because it kept being used rather than preserved. Palmer's farmhouse sits on the same lane. Unlike the Arden house, it remains largely unchanged and privately occupied. Not a museum, not a heritage site, just a house, 2 Tudor buildings, one famous, one invisible. The invisible one is arguably more intact. Mary Arden's farm gets Shakespeare Birthplace Trust funding, conservation grants, visitor revenue, careful restoration informed by building archaeology and documentary research. Every intervention documented, every material choice debated, every structural decision made with preservation standards and public access requirements in mind. Palmer's farmhouse gets none of that. 500 years of ad hoc repairs by people trying to keep weather out and structure sound. Generations of modifications made without architects, without heritage consultants, without funding, just continuous occupation requiring continuous maintenance. Which building is more authentic? The one preserved to tell a story about Shakespeare's mother, or the one that simply continued being lived in by people who never became famous? The famous property had more interventions, more restorations, more interpretive layering. The invisible property had more neglect, more improvisation, more unbroken use. Both are real Tudor farmhouses. One became heritage, the other stayed home. The actual remarkable fact isn't the buildings, it's that the same fields are still farmed. Agricultural continuity across 5 centuries in industrialized England is rare. Enclosure, mechanization, shifts from arable to pastoral, all reshaped agriculture repeatedly. That Wilmcote remained small-scale enough for Tudor buildings to still function agriculturally is the real anomaly. Shakespeare's family farmed land people are still farming today. The manor got famous, the farmhouses got forgotten. Both are still standing. 9. Abbotsbury, Dorset, population around 450. A village that grew around a Benedictine abbey dissolved by Henry VIII in 1539, with multiple Tudor-era farmhouses built from abbey stone immediately after, still in residential use. When Henry dissolved Abbotsbury Abbey, local families bought the stone and built houses with it, not metaphorically, literally. Stone cut and dressed by medieval masons for sacred space, repurposed for domestic buildings within a generation. This was so common after dissolution, it barely rated comment at the time. Monastery becomes building supply depot. The theological implications are interesting. Sacred space desacralized through reuse, but the practical story is more telling. People built with what was available. Suddenly, hundreds of tons of high-quality dressed stone were available. The abbey that stood for 500 years is now fragmentary ruins, picturesque and unroofed. The houses built from its bones 480 years ago are still inhabited, still functional, still keeping rain out. Durability isn't about original purpose or status, it's about continuous usefulness. Sacred buildings that lost their function became quarries. Domestic buildings that kept their function kept standing. 10. Ightham, Kent. Population around 1,600. A village in the Weald where timber-framed Tudor farmhouses line the lanes, many still in private agricultural use surrounding Ightham Moat. A moated manor house occupied continuously since the 14th century. Ightham Moat was magnificent, and it nearly died. By 1985, the last private owner couldn't afford maintenance. National Trust took it over, spent millions on restoration, now operates it as heritage site with admission fees, guided tours, careful conservation. The Tudor farmhouses around it had no such rescue. They needed no rescue. They survived by continuing to be farms. The manor house was too important to lose and too expensive to keep. The farmhouses were too ordinary to notice and too useful to abandon. Different survival mechanisms entirely. Manor houses survived through institutional intervention or extraordinary private wealth. Farmhouses survived by remaining functional to people with ordinary resources. The manor got famous, the farmhouses got forgotten, both still standing. These buildings lasted 500 years not through special care but through being built well and staying useful. Continuous modification, not preservation, kept them alive. Every generation added chimneys, enlarged windows, installed plumbing, routed electricity through timber frames never designed for it. The buildings survived precisely because they kept changing. Useful things get maintained, museums require funding. The survival mechanism was almost never intentional preservation. It was economic irrelevance at the right moments, single ownership preventing piecemeal redevelopment, depopulation, eliminating development pressure, buildings too expensive to demolish and too structurally sound to fall down. The uncomfortable truth running through all 10. What lasted wasn't necessarily what we loved most. It was what we couldn't afford to lose and couldn't afford to replace. Tudor farmers with hand tools built houses that have stood half a millennium. We build homes designed to last 50 years. The question isn't why theirs survived so long. It's why we stopped building things meant to outlive us.